Yo yo yo, I welcome each and every one of you to a new Genshin Impact video. My name is Trup and I am bringing you today another batch of some ASMR tips regarding elemental masteries, elements, reactions, defenses, and generating energy and all that juicy stuff we need to go through first before we dive into actual team building. I already wanted to make a character, or rather team building guide, already back when I made the AR30 plus endgame video, but I realized there's so much more to this game that I feel the audience, you guys, players, should be able to understand first before we dive into that. And well, so it's not just blindly following my advices or my teams that I'm going to tell you that are good, but so that you actually understand what's going on behind it, all the alchemy, all the reactions, behind it, so that you can come up with teams on your own in the future if new characters come out, and so on. We will be talking about three topics today. First of all, we have defenses and elemental resistances. That's what we need to cover. And let me pop quickly into the character selection screen so I can show you. We will hopefully be able to see, and right down below, if you scroll in the attributes tab, you will see different resistances. You got physical, and then there's elemental resistance for each element. So physical resistance obviously reduces damage from physical attacks, and elemental resistances decrease damage from said element by a certain percentage if you've got the resistance on. That can be gained from some artifact pieces and whatnot. And there's the defense stat, which is also important. So why is this important? Because this does not only apply to us, but also to the mobs we're hunting, we're killing. And we don't have right now a way to bring down defense other than some constellations and talents maybe, but we do have basically two effective ways to bring down resistances. And these values are different for each mob you're fighting. For hill trolls, or whatever they called, it's like 10% defense, 10% resistances. For the Ruin Guard down there, he's got, for example, a 70% physical resistance. So that's like good to know, I think. But yeah, once again, the most common enemies, the slow, small, weak ones, have 10% defense and 10% resistance. So this is important to know because we can reduce those resistances down and effectively increase our DPS. So let's take a look at one of the ways we can do this. The first one, the obvious one, I mean there's more, right? But we're going to focus on the two that are most effective. The first one is an emo set, and having an emo character on your team. Let me quickly just find the emo set. Nope. Oh no, that's the pyro one. Right here it is. Yeah. So if you read the 4-piece set bonus, it increases your swirl damage, blah blah, but the important part, decreases opponent's elemental resistance to the element infused in the swirl by 40% for 10 seconds. So here's the way to reduce the elemental resistances of our enemies, right? That's great, working great with... That's why Anemo supports are great for your teams. Even on their own, they can do this and help you with your damage. And well, this method has only one flaw, and that happens when enemies have elements of their own. So if enemy has an element of their own, you can't infuse the swirl with the element that you want. So if you take a look at, for example, I can just recall quickly the Fatui skirmishers. Like, for example, the cryo guy, he will pop his shield and gain a cryo element. So, or these flowers, like any enemies that have already an element on their own are gonna be kind of screwing up this strategy, because you won't be able to apply the element you want to the swirl. So if I'm using Chonk and I want to take down the enemy's cryo resistance, that's fine. But what if I'm using what if not Fischl? What if I'm using Razor and I want to bring down his let's say Electro? That's not a good example, but let's work with that. And the enemy has cryo on him, so it's just not gonna work. You can't do it, right? Um, that's just the way the game is right now, so you got to take that into account. But there's also one other way we can do this, and that's by creating a reaction with characters that are cryo and with characters that are electro. That creates an elemental reaction called superconduct, which reduces the enemy resistances again by 40%. To be more specific, this elemental reaction reduces only the physical resistances of the enemies, so that's why it is important to bring these characters or like this reaction into your physical DPS team, because it's gonna be a huge help. So let's take a quick look at what happens with hill churls, which have 10% physical resistance, if we apply superconduct and reduce it by 40%. So what happens then is we take that 10% off and we're at 0, right? And then we're left with 30% more. But there's a little problem, and at 0%, all the resistance we decrease further below 0 is halved. So we take a half of 30, which is 15, and that's the amount we get. So we will end up at minus 15 physical resistance, and this still increases your DPS even if you drop below 0. Their resistance is below 0, and this is an equivalent to about 28% physical damage increase, and you can test it by yourself on slimes or whatever, but that's the way it works. So as to why is this important to understand, it's because it really depends on the enemies you're fighting, but you gotta consider which DPS you bring. So if you've got that Ruin Guard right there that has 70% increased physical resistance, you know, it might be easier to just hit him with a couple of spells and abilities to damage him. But if you decide to bring physical DPS, then you just make sure you bring the superconduct as well into your team to help with your damage. This is also an important factor in terms of Spiral Abyss, because each room, as you may know already, has different affixes which boost your characters, and you should build your team around that. But if you take a look, you're not going to find, I don't think there's any buffs to physical damage in terms of the disorders in different floors. As you can see, there's Pyro and floor 11. There's superconduct, that's something. It's, I guess, an indirect buff to physical damage, because it only increases the damage of the reaction, but once again, it does not buff physical damage. So you won't find any physical damage buffs in the Spiral Abyss, only a bit like elemental buffs. That's what I mean. So you gotta consider that as well when building your teams. We're obviously talking about the late game here in Spiral Abyss, but what this effectively means is just that physical teams will perform. They will not scale well into the late game if you're looking to push Spiral Abyss, for example. So for a quick recap, we've talked about defenses and how they can be brought down by a couple of constellations or talents. But more importantly on the resistances, which can be brought down very effectively with a swirl and superconduct. Swirl for elemental resistances and superconduct for physical resistances. And that's probably it, right? There's also, yeah, I forgot. I think my Chonk in his last new talent that I unlocked just recently, as the same thing for defenses, same applies for resistances. right? So yeah. Yeah, your characters can also have abilities that decrease resistances, like my Chong, for example, decreases cryo resistance for 8 seconds once his Spirit Blade or whatever his E ability ends. So that's for resistances and defenses, and we can move on to the next thing, which is elemental reactions. Elemental reactions, as you probably know by now, can be created by combining different elements on top of your enemies, and this applies to your characters as well. So these reactions deal damage on enemies or to you. But let's talk about enemies. They deal damage based on your level, based on elemental mastery and enemies' resistances, and maybe certain artifacts and constellations can boost it as well, but that's the main three are level, elemental mastery, and enemy resistances. So, for example, if you create Overload, the damage will be based on your level, on your elemental mastery, and on enemies' pyro resistance. And that is also why one of your main stats you're looking for on your support characters is going to be elemental mastery to increase the damage. You will always be capped at some point on your levels, and you will always be fighting enemies with some elemental resistances, which can be brought down again. We've talked about this, but elemental mastery is something you can scale infinitely and work on effectively in terms of your artifacts and whatnot. That's like the only part of the equation that you can really work on. There's also one more important matter that the game doesn't tell you much about, I think, and this is about whose damage is taken, or like whose elemental mastery is taken into consideration when creating elemental reactions. Because you obviously need two characters, so you're probably wondering, like, is it combined? Is it based on the first guy who applies the element, or on the second one who procs it? And the later one is the truth, because it always takes the elemental mastery of the proccing unit, not the one who laid the first element. So a quick example would be you drop Fischl's E, her bird pops Electro on the enemy, and then you pop Kaya's Q, which hits the enemy and procs a Superconduct, and that will take into the account Kaya's elemental mastery, not Fischl's. That would be all on the topic of elemental mastery, but let's move on to elemental reactions. And it's interesting, we can basically classify them into, or like separate them into two different categories. We've got amplifying ones, which are melt and vaporize, which multiply your damage, and there's transforming ones, which create an additional hit, and those are all the other ones, so superconductor, swirl, shattered, overload, electrocharged. And for the amplifying ones, melt and vaporize, those are only possible with pyro on top of ice, cryo, or on top of water. As to why it is important to classify them as such, it is because of their different scaling. Transforming reactions do not scale with your talents, levels, attack, crits, or elemental damage percentage, and will not become stronger as you upgrade your characters. Transformation reactions deal damage in ratios, so you start with one, which is your superconductor, then you got swirl, shattered, overload, electrocharged, and as you can see on the screen, and just a quick example so you can understand, your superconductor is the base, and for example, overload would deal 4 times as much damage as superconductor. And since you will be poorly geared early on, transformation reactions will be very strong and will make up a large percentage of your damage. As you gear up your characters, increase their talent levels, their attack, crit values, and elemental damage, later on the damage of transformation reactions might fall off and amplifying reactions may become stronger, just because, well, they multiply your damage instead of creating an additional hit. but you will have to test this out eventually by yourselves. The last important matter we have to discuss before we get into team building is energy and energy generation. So each character's burst ability, Q basically, requires a certain amount of energy. You can check that for each character. Each has a different cost. You can check that underneath the talents tab, where you can click on skill attributes of the ability and check the energy cost. And the best and most straightforward way to acquire elemental energy is to use your skills, your E basically, on any characters. And for example, on Venti, if you use RE, it would generate a green energy particles, elemental particles that are an emo. It depends on the skill and on the attribute of your elemental attribute of your character that's using it. What's important is that each ability generates a different amount, or rather a range of particles, and some characters' abilities don't generate any. That's, for example, Barbara and Noelle. Their E abilities are basically buffs or shields and do not interact with enemies, basically. So they don't generate any elemental particles. Each elemental particle gives more elemental energy to characters with the corresponding element. So a wind particle would give more energy to Venti instead of Barbara. Barbara, on the other hand, would get only a third of that. So any other character that's not associated with the element of the particle will get only a third of the energy. There's also another scaling on top of that, which comes with the party. So each other member than your selected character. So we have Fischl right now, for example. Fischl would get 100% of all the particles, and the rest of the team would get only 90% on top of the other equations, like third. So 90% of the third of the energy, and so on. So for example, with Kaya, he procs his E and gets some cryo particles. He would get 100%. And since Chunk is the same element as the particles we were picking up, he would not get a third, but a full amount. But since he's not selected as our main character, he would only get 90% of that. I hope I am as clear as possible and you understand what I'm trying to explain here. There is also one more way to generate elemental particles, and that is by simply dealing damage. So these particles are clear particles, and they give the same amount of energy to each character. So for example, if we find a hill churl, which is down here, right? He will drop a clear elemental particle at 50% HP, and when he dies, see? I just pick up a clear elemental particle which charged up my Q. And if I smack him some more, he will drop another one when he dies. So we kill him. And we get another white one, clear one. So yeah, you can generate elemental particles simply by dealing damage. As you can see, one more time, we'll showcase this. So we will hit him a couple of times to get him to about 50%. Still not. One more. There we go. Another one. And then we kill him. And we get another clear particle. So that is another way to generate particles. And so you may be asking, how does this all relate to team building? And let me tell you, it is important because, as you can tell, this means that energy regenerates faster by using characters of the same element on your team. So that's why you see me using Chonk and Kaya in this example. So you've got to take all this information into account when building your teams. So, well, you get two cryo ones, for example, two of the same element, you get the resonance boost, you will get faster particles, but on the other hand, you will lose another element in your party, so maybe elemental reactions will suffer a bit more because, well, you only can combine, in my case, ice with water and electro, and I could be playing a fire character in there and getting another elemental reaction, and actually a bunch of them because you can combine them between them. And so this is all you need to consider when building your team. And we finally covered everything we needed to, so I hope you guys understood this. I hope I made myself as clear as possible. This should give you some good understanding of the game mechanics, and should help you prepare for or give you a better understanding on how to build your teams, which we and I will cover in the next video. If there's something that you want to ask, if there is something that I missed and you think should be mentioned here, and if you think that I said some things incorrectly, make sure to comment, please. I would really love to hear from you. And if this video was helpful at all, please smash that like button and subscribe. See you guys in the next video. Thanks. Bye.